The title of this next session is The High Road to Productivity. I'm not quite sure what the low road is. Well, I think we've got an idea what the low road is. But we're going to welcome back Ged Kearney, President of the ACTU, to talk now about job security as it relates to high performance, productive and innovative workplaces and the extent to which they're at least part of the key to future Australian productivity growth. Would you please welcome back Ged Kearney.
Thanks very much, Kerry, and thank you everybody who's come back for the last session of the day. I really appreciate it. That sunshine is very tempting, I know. But I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd very much like to congratulate Philip and the organisers of the conference that we're enjoying today. The calibre of the speakers has been amazing, and the diversity of the presentation and the views have been stimulating. And I think that I was just having a chat to Philip before, and I think that's what's important, is to have diversity of opinions and views. It's okay for those things to be presented at conferences like this so you can absorb, take away and make up your own mind. And it's no mean feat to get representatives of those views from different sectors and stakeholders in the one room, so well done. As a board member of the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency and its predecessor Skills Australia, I've been immersed in the challenges of developing a skilled workforce that can compete in a global economy. My board colleagues and I do not always agree 100% on the path to get there, but we do share a common cause in building an economy that provides decent work and prosperity. And the voices of Australian workers must always be heard in this debate. They must be heard because they are affected by changes to workforces and to labour markets. But they also must be heard because workers have a lot of insight and fresh thinking to contribute. And I'm a strong believer in the ingenuity, the diligence and the skills of Australian workers. They are the nation's greatest economic asset, and they are a fundamental part of the equation for ongoing productivity and economic growth. But for employers to get the best out of their workers, they have to be prepared to invest in them, to provide their workers with secure jobs, decent wages and conditions, with access to training, some control over the way their work is organised, and to be prepared to consult and work together with their workforce and indeed their unions. Good employers know the benefits of this approach. They know that workers faced with uncertainty about their income and working hours from week to week and a lack of autonomy over their work are of course less likely to be engaged, productive and innovative in the workplace. Unfortunately, far too often we see employers going in the opposite direction, adopting a business model that seeks to extract short-term profits by shifting the risks and costs associated with operating a business onto workers. But these short-term gains come at the expense of longer-term productivity and of the benefits that can come from investing in workers and workers' capabilities. And I believe at the cost of our longer-term competitiveness in a globalised, information-based economy. So today I'd like to talk about an alternative approach. But first, we need to understand the productivity problem that confronts us. We need to honestly ask ourselves, is there a problem? What is the real state of the Australian productivity? At the outset, it's important that we separate myth from reality on industrial relations and productivity. The recent review of the Fair Work Act comprehensively debunked the idea that Australia's workplace system is holding back productivity growth. Australia's fastest rate of productivity growth in decades was recorded in the mid-1990s, and it's been slowing ever since, including during the Work Choices industrial relations period. Each business cycle since the mid-90s has seen slower productivity growth than the previous cycle. The peak occurred over a decade before the current Fair Work Act. The strongest sustained rate of productivity growth Australia has experienced was in the post-war period, incidentally, under centralised wage fixing. It was a period with high levels of job security, relatively little non-permanent, temporary or casual work, and was behind high tariff walls. In the mid-90s, labour productivity grew faster than average, and since then the growth has, as we know, been slower. But it's still been growing. It's not going backwards, as the front pages of some of our business press would lead you to believe. Under a work choices industrial relations regime, labour productivity in the market sector grew at an average annualised rate of 1.1%. Since the Fair Work Act's come into effect, the average annualised rate's been slightly higher at 1.4%. In fact, in the year to the March quarter of this year, market sector labour productivity grew by 5.3%, the fastest pace in over a decade. I'm not suggesting that this means we should be complacent. Now, according to the recent McKinsey Global Institute report, Beyond the Boom, Australia's Productivity Imperative, growth in labour productivity was still far lower over the past 6 years than it was during the 90s. But we do need to take a reality check about some of the more outrageous claims, I think, about productivity. And we must look beyond blaming workers as the only reason for slowdown in productivity. Ironically, a substantial part of the productivity slowdown has been to the boom in mining that is frequently credited as our economic saviour. McKinsey says that it is capital productivity, not labour, that is the biggest drag on growth. A big part of that is explained by large investments sunk in projects that, of course, are yet to deliver. McKinsey estimates that the decline in capital productivity between 2005 and 11, almost entirely due to resources, resulted in total lost national income of $43 billion. And by contrast, labour productivity added $17 billion over the same period. Unions care about productivity growth. We want productivity growth. We know it's the only way to sustainably increase national income. And we welcome any form of national discussion about productivity, but we will come to the table armed with facts and concerns of workers from our factories, from our shops, from offices, from all the workplaces of Australia. It just has to be a two-way discussion. We share the government's aspiration to lift productivity after it's languished. We understand that higher productivity is the primary means by which we can grow, but employees do expect to be fairly rewarded for their efforts. Higher labour productivity will be encouraged when workers feel they share fairly in the economic benefits of any growth. In the 1990s, the gains were distributed fairly evenly between capital and labour. Today, labour income in the economy grew at around the same pace. In the 90s, total labour income in the economy grew at around the same pace as productivity. In the 2000s, real wages growth was decoupled from productivity and has lagged behind. In simple terms, labour's share of the national income has fallen, while returns to capital as a share of income have risen, even in mining. Since the mining boom started, average nominal wages in the mining industry have risen by 50%. That sounds good. However, the prices that mining companies receive for their products have increased by 175%. Of course, those mining wages, as I said, still represent a solid real wage increase, which is what matters to workers. But unlike during the 1990s, when labour and capital shared more or less equally in productivity gains and we experienced record productivity growth, the first decade of the new millennium has seen real wages failing to keep up with productivity growth. and the overall rate of growth has slowed down. Now, I don't think that this is mere coincidence, because productivity is more likely to increase when workers feel that they stand to gain a fair share of the dividends of growth. The veteran Fairfax business journalist Ian Verinder alluded to this in a recent column that bore the headline, "Ignore the propaganda, cutting wages will not fix productivity." And like McKinsey, he pointed out that the real culprit for the decline is capital. He wrote, "It's our managers who've let us down, not our workforce. The unending campaign to drastically reshape our industrial relations system could come back to bite the business sector." Verinder says, "Our productivity problem will best be solved through investment in new and more efficient machines and in education to produce more skilled workers and better managers, not with a slash and burn approach to wages and conditions. The endless pursuit of labour market flexibility by creating a more insecure, casualised workforce has a direct impact on consumer confidence. If people are unable to spend and unable to get finance for loans, that must have a detrimental effect on consumer demand. And for businesses with a domestic focus that undermines their long-term sustainability." Others like Ross Gittins of the Fairfax and David Gruen of the Federal Treasury have made very similar points. So Australia's relatively low productivity growth is a matter for concern. However, it's a long-term problem. Labour laws are not the cause of productivity problems, and they're not the solution. Instead, our productivity debate needs to focus on the real sources of sustainable productivity, which we all know are growth, skills, education, infrastructure, technology, innovation, and really importantly, quality management. So in that context, I'd like to sketch out this afternoon what I see as one of the big challenges to our ability to invest in our workforce, and that is the growth of insecure work. In many ways, the growth of insecure work is also one of the great unintended consequences of the period of reform that Labor led Australia through in the 80s and 90s, that reform that I was discussing with Tony Jones this afternoon. It's also a prime example of an area where we need to develop new approaches to social protection or insurance. Today, the average Australian worker is exposed to far higher levels of risk than in the past, but we are not adequately supporting them to help manage those risks. As many of you would be aware, last year the ACTU initiated an independent inquiry to help understand the impact of these changes on the nature and the distribution of work. That inquiry was chaired by the former Deputy Prime Minister, Brian Howe, ably assisted by a panel including Paul Munro, who was formerly of the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, Associate Professor Sarah Charlesworth from the University of South Australia, and Jill Biddington, a union educator and organiser. Now, the inquiry examined the growth of poor quality jobs that provide people with little economic security and little control over their working lives. The characteristics of these jobs include unpredictable and fluctuating pay, inferior rights and entitlements, limited or no access to paid leave, a lack of certainty over job tenure, and a lack of say at work. Employers argue that insecure work has many benefits. Some argue that during the global financial crisis, the widespread use of these practices allowed a reduction in employees' hours rather than retrenching workers. And a good example of these arguments is found in the BCA's supplementary submission to the review of the Fair Work Act. Now, this may be reasonable in time of crisis, but as commentators such as Mark Wooden and even some employer groups themselves have recognised, reduction in working hours together with associated insecurity have been established patterns for at least 2 decades, even more. Part-time workers, be they permanent or casual, are often seeking more working hours and more pay just to make ends meet. There's also a tendency among proponents of insecure work to conveniently conflate casual and part-time work. Some permanent part-time workers may work flexibly and enjoy control over their hours, but this is not the typical pattern experienced by casual workers who work when the employer needs them and often at very short notice. At the moment, ABS data tells us that these include about a quarter of the workforce. So a quarter of the workforce who do not have paid leave entitlements and are deemed as casuals. Indeed, our rate of casual work is second only to Spain amongst the OECD countries. The Howe inquiry documented the scale of the changes that have occurred in typical work contracts and working patterns. It's not only casual work that is a concern. ABS data tells us that nearly 40% of our workforce are in non-standard, precarious type of employment. Alternative estimates based on Hilda data produce similar numbers. We're seeing an increasingly complex array of work contracts in our economy, many of which pose different challenges. There's 2.2 million workers today employed as casual, over 300,000 employed on fixed-term contracts, 500,000 independent contractors are engaged in what we call sham contracting, where a commercial arrangement actually masks an employment relationship. A further 300,000 contractors are dependent contractors in the sense that they have one client or employer. And according to ABS, more than 140,000 workers are engaged on an ongoing basis through labour hire agencies, although the Productivity Commission has estimated the real number to be more than twice this. This stark division between those in permanent, secure work and those stuck in insecure, casual and contract jobs is indicative of a new divide in the Australian workforce. It is a divide between those at the core and those living on the periphery. Tackling this divide requires a radical new approach to training the workforce targeted at those on the periphery. As Dr. Mike Keating has argued, when we think about where to focus our investment in skills, those who are presently least competitive in the labour market are likely to deliver the biggest returns. The Howe inquiry delivered a landmark report, Lives on Hold, which was released at the ACTU Congress last May. The 53 recommendations of the Howe inquiry are far-reaching and comprehensive. They include, for example, labour law reforms to provide a stronger universal set of protections to all workers. These could be done through an improved definition of casual work or expanding the NES, introducing a licensing system for labour hire or stronger enforcement of actual existing laws. He recommended reforms to achieve a more skilled workforce, including a broader focus on work-life transitions and a commitment to lifelong learning. He recommended reforms to the tax and transfer system to provide a stronger safety net. He recommended that governments at all levels make stronger use of their leverage as employers, funders and purchasers to secure jobs. He said we need a shared commitment with the community sector to dealing with the issues of insecure work where it interacts with society outside the workplace. And we definitely need more research into the nature and impact of precarious employment. The Howe inquiry also shone the spotlight onto the personal toll that insecure work takes on people's lives. There is complete inability to plan for the future, to save or get a loan for a house, the disruption to family and social lives, and the overall anxiety caused by a lack of job security. I had recent personal experience of this when my daughter, 25-year-old teacher who has a 1-year tenure, had a serious health issue. She has been advised to have children as soon as possible. How can I, Mum? How can I when I don't even know if I can get maternity leave? I can't get a loan to buy a house. I'm not even married. That was the least of my worries, to be honest. But she's lucky. She's got me. And of course my response is, darling, I'll support you. You know, she's very lucky. She has a secure family. Many people don't have that luxury. This was starkly confirmed, this anxiety is starkly confirmed by the Emmy Bank Household Financial Comfort Report that was released earlier this week. Very long name, but it revealed that casual workers have a much higher level of financial stress than permanents. But what we also need to understand is there is a cost for business. Precarious work represents a use and throw away mentality that does not help to build a productive economy or a sustainable society in the long term. It erodes our skills base. Precarious employees receive fewer training opportunities through their employer than their permanent counterparts, and they're often left to organise and fund their own skills development, which leads into that market failure that we were discussing earlier. Insecure work also leads to a less motivated workforce. As the Australia Institute noted in its submission to the Howe inquiry, almost by definition, a casual worker has little vested interest in the job in question, and employers have little interest in the casual employee. In short, reducing paying conditions will not lead to greater employment or productivity growth, but creating security around employment, creating career development opportunities, and providing access to training will. I don't see how we can develop a culture of training and development without secure employment arrangements, without engaged and committed employees. Smart businesses realise this. The Australian Financial Review recently reported that since Wesfarmers took over Coles supermarkets in 2007, there's been a radical change in workplace culture away from casualisation to permanency. Up until 3 years ago, 70 to 80% of Coles' 87,000 team members were casuals, and some of them may have been lucky to get one shift a month. One of the first things the new management did was begin to sign people up on permanent arrangements, inverting the proportion of casual to permanent workers. Today, less than 30% of the chain staff are on casual working arrangements, and this has been a key factor in Coles' financial turnaround. Absenteeism has fallen from 12.5% to 3%, and staff retention's up. Factor also into this lower training and development costs that come each time a new employee is taken on board. Coles has found that proof is in the pudding. So how do we get back up to those productivity peaks of the 90s? Well, we need to set aside the shallow notion that the only way to increase productivity is through the low road, through cutting wages and conditions. Will so-called flexibility deliver higher short-term profits? Probably. But will it lead to real gains in productivity? I don't think so. To lift national productivity over the long term, as I said, requires investment in skills, education, training and infrastructure, and with an incentive of higher real wages delivered through collective bargaining or true negotiations with employees. We need a combined effort to lift workforce participation, particularly in the face of an ageing population. And women, particularly mothers, still face barriers to full participation in the workforce. It really worries me when I say women just need to become independent contractors and work from home. Yes, they can work from home because then they can look after the kids and do the washing and answer the phone and cook the tea as well as try to hold down a full-time job. It's not necessarily the answer. We need further efforts to address these, including strengthening rights to access flexible work arrangements for women, work arrangements that meet workers' needs as well as the enterprise needs. The complex interaction of the tax and transfer systems needs to be addressed so it doesn't act as a disincentive for low-paid people to increase their hours. Increasing the New Start allowance by a few extra dollars a day is not going to create a bludger mentality. It might actually assist some unemployed people into the labour market. And for businesses, a good place to start would be accepting that a secure job is far from an impediment to productivity. It should be a vital precondition. If workers are well paid with a reasonable degree of security, developing skills, put them to good place in the workplace, productivity will increase. If they're consulted fully in any change, they will feel involved. Then you are more likely to have productive and engaged workforce. So security can be gained in a modern global economy, and I think, in fact, a modern global economy will depend on it. Thank you.
We've lost our capacity to sit down, Ged, but yes, maybe it's better for us, I don't know. Casualisation, something that's really been going since the 70s. That's when it started. So that's 40 years. You talk about an example like Coles to suggest that the genie might not be out of the bottle, that you possibly can reverse the process, but can you really?
That's a very good question. And it's not just casualisation I want to point out, it's these other growing areas of independent contracting, short-term contracts, etc. I'm not saying that we have to offer everyone a permanent job. I know that that is unrealistic. But what we're suggesting, and I think what the How inquiry is trying to get at, is that we can build safety nets around this type of work if indeed we can't turn back the juggernaut. Certainly my preference would be to give people permanent jobs, and I hope that that is part of the answer. But a proper safety net, perhaps, you know, this concept of lifelong learning bank accounts that I suggested before, making sure that people get access to basic things like sick leave, childcare leave, annual leave. You know, 40% of our workforce don't even get holidays. So building these constructs around that mobile workforce could be the answer.
Given that more often than not, the two arms of the Labor movement are in lockstep, as in the Labor Party and Labor governments when they're in, and the trade union movement, and bearing in mind that for 18 of the last 30 years we've had Labor national governments, and for a lot of that time you've had a lot of state Labor governments, isn't it a failure of Labor governments, your partner in the Labor movement, in terms of the growth of casualisation, if we accept your argument that it's fundamentally bad, or does it just underscore the fact that casualisation has been an unstoppable trend?
There's lots of layers to that question. An important thing about Brian Howe's report is that he says he accepts responsibility, that this is one perhaps of the unintended consequences of the great financial and economic readjustment period of the 80s and 90s. And yes, it's something that they didn't think about, and yes, it's something that wasn't addressed by Labor governments.
But it was already happening in the 70s.
Possibly it was. So perhaps, I think though that it's been compounded possibly by those reforms, and I think it's sped up dramatically. And yes, I think the union movement has some responsibility as well. We took the finger off the pulse with it. In some terms, you know, we contracted and looked after our core, as I talked about the core and the periphery. It's very difficult to organise mobile casual workers and fight for them, so you tend to look after the ones that you have. So yes, you know, we take some responsibility for that too, but I don't think it's too late.
We've got questions from the audience. It's not easy to pick up necessarily. Is that, we've got a question coming up? Yes, just over here.
Just more of a comment actually about the impact that casualised workforce actually has on the core workers, as you were saying, Ged, in terms of the skills that they need to develop to enable to sustain that organisational culture, and how it actually has such a huge impact on organisation culture as well, this casualisation of workforce.
Yep, I'm sure it does. That's a comment I think I've impressed on.
Yeah, so you're just agreeing?
I agree.
Right, okay. Now, if you listen to the Minister, Chris Evans, it's, that was a very tentative a Labor movement colleague. You get the sense, I mean, the extent to which you get the sense that fundamentally the future is about skilling and or reskilling. And you do that, everything else falls into place. Now, do you buy that?
I think it's part of it, isn't it? It's part of the equation. I think we need to be re-skilled to adapt to a very quick changing economy. I was having a chat to a gentleman before who made a very good point to me, saying when people stayed in jobs for 40 years, there wasn't really that quick pace of rapid technological change, and things weren't changing as fast. And now when people move through jobs quickly, part of the reason is because life is changing and there's new areas to open up and new innovation products to work on. So I think reskilling is a vitally important part of it, which is why I really like Brian's idea of this lifelong learning bucket of money, I guess you call it. But it's only part of it, isn't it? I mean,
but then what do you say to the Hugh Lauder line that there's a fairy tale aspect to this? You know, you get the skills, you'll get the job, and you'll get the job security to go with it. Is it as simple as that?
No, of course not. Well, no, of course not, because there are so many factors involved. I mean, there's so many barriers to people getting skills. You can't just say everybody's going to go out there and it's a perfect market and a perfect world and we're all going to get skilled up. The people sitting in this room know much better than me what the barriers to that actually happening are. So there's lots of societal things that we need to address to make that a reality.
Yeah. Have we got any more questions from the audience? Yes, over here on the right.
Yeah, I just thought I'd just comment on both your points you just made there.
Is that here?
Yes.
I mean, if I may, part of the problem with this and why we've seen this casualisation of labour is to do with the short-term financing of companies, the quarterly reporting of companies, and the CEO packages which relate to it. So the issue is a much broader one than just skill. So I'm not saying that skills are a fairy tale, but the story that's told about them is a fairy tale. Skills are clearly nevertheless very important, but you then need the system of governance of companies to fall into place, so that the only way you can look at that is to look at the long-term financing in East Asia or in Germany and see the way they relate to skills and what they do in relation to casualisation. I'm not saying they're perfect, they're certainly not, but they haven't got this kind of level of casualisation. So it's the broader picture you need to look at.
And I think I referred to that in my presentation when I said we look at things, simple things like the tax, well, they're not simple, the complex tax transfer system and the barriers to people, you know, unemployment, actually getting into employment. We look at funding mechanisms. The federal government funds the community sector, for example, on very short-term cycles, so they can only employ people on short-term cycles because that's how the funding is organised. There's lots of complexities around this issue.
I mean, I don't want to send you away depressed, Ged, but I'm not saying anything you not already well and truly aware of. But if you were to look at the trend, the trend in the workforce and the trend in the trade union movement and the strength of the trade union movement, it does only seem to be going one way, doesn't it? And I just wonder how, you know, the net generation that Phil Riven referred to, how are you going to convince that generation of workers coming through that they need trade unions?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think that the two, you know, the falling density of the trade union movement is pretty closely linked to these changes in the workforce. As I said before, you know, we've let it slide a little bit. They're very difficult to organise and, you know, a mobile, fearful workforce. Often people don't join a union because they're frightened to join. They won't get a shift. This is what we're hearing. They don't get offered the contract again if they make a fuss or complain through their trade union. That's one thing. The second thing is, you know, trade union membership has plateaued over the last couple of years. We've stayed at about 19% density, which is quite low, I know, by world standards. I think most countries are around 23 to 25. However, 50,000 people joined a union last year, and there are still 2 million paid-up members in the trade union movement. 2 million. That's the biggest political organisation in this country. They still have a lot of political clout. We have 300,000 activists in the workplace. And, you know, in 2007, we were organised enough to have a major impact on a federal election. If we can garner that support, and I think insecure work is an issue that is really close to the heart of all the workers, I'm convinced of that, and I won't bore you with why. I think we can reorganise, and I think you look at what's happening in America with the 99% issue. People are looking for someone. They are looking for someone to tackle this issue. It could be us.
Okay, now we're just one question here, which will be the last. Try and keep it brief.
Ged, a question in regard to the Minister's comment about shortening apprenticeships as a way of addressing the skills needs of Australia.
Sorry, a comment about that?
Yes.
About the shortening of apprenticeships.
Well, what the ACTU position?
We're not opposed to that. Definitely, as long as it is still thoroughly competency-based and they are properly assessed and that they reach the competencies that are required of that skill level. By all means, you know, we would be happily get apprentices into full paid jobs and workplaces as soon as possible, but we wouldn't want to see any quality in the training decline because time was the imperative, I guess would be our concern.
And that's where this session comes to an end. Would you please thank Ged Kearney.